Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you're listening. And welcome to part 6 of our book club with Jessie on her book, 5 Minutes of Grief. I'm looking forward to it. I don't know, are we halfway through, or I think there's still a lot of chapters, so I don't think
I
we're going
think
to
we're
end
more
it.
than halfway through, so
Yeah,
that's a good thing.
but we're definitely not going to be finished by today, but I'm looking
Correct.
forward to the next part because last week was amazing. It was amazing. Not last week, last month.
hmm
Yeah, thank you for everybody for joining. Hi, Jessie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, so looking forward to today's chapter and the discussion. We always have really good discussion, so
Yeah, always. Well, great. Well, I'm gonna give it over to you. Let's dive
all
into your
right,
book.
we will do some diving here.
Love it.
All right, so I think we left off on chapter 17, which is called titled "I'm Torn." It says there are moments that we have to make decisions. In the shock and grief, I'm so torn. The morticians had asked, "Do you and your family want to see the body?" My initial reaction is no, no, I don't want to see the body. But my youngest son overhears the conversation and pipes in, "Don't you dare cremate him until I see him. I can't go on with life till I see the body." Did those words really come out of the mouth of a 13-year-old? They did. So here I am in the valley of decision. I cannot deny my son what he needs for my own selfish reasons. Or I could surrender my own needs for my son's. I know I made the right choice. We find ourselves in a tiny room before Josiah's body. No one can understand unless their feet have walked into the silence of that place. The body lying empty on a table. It looks so peaceful and quiet, I can barely breathe. I hold back tears for the sake of my son who must see his brother. I will be strong. I will be there for him. Lord, I hate this place where silence and death dwell. So,
Wow.
as we talk about, that's kind of one of the harder chapters. And all of us who have, lost loved ones, or, we either have two situations. Um, you know, we may not choose to see the body, and we may choose to have like a closed casket, or um, something that we view at the funeral home. But it's I guess I run into that all the time in the chaplain field, where there's just all those decisions, and sometimes for us ourselves, we have to be in that place of decision about end of life things, and or we have to walk that discussion with a family member, and that can be a challenge. um I have a lot of patients that, as they get closer to death, they begin to struggle with, do I get buried? Do I ask to be cremated? Do I leave that decision up to the family? A lot of people just don't want to think about it, but it is something. Usually, if they're older and or have a chronic illness where they're put on hospice, usually there'll be hospice staff or others who are encouraging them to make that decision and to make out their plans for end of life. And how many of you have had to be in that place where either you're having to make end of life plans for yourself or for a loved one? Has anybody here had to deal with that?
Not yet, no.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Yes,
Oh,
we can now, Annette.
woo! I was going to say, it seems like the people who are, it's probably wise to do it ahead of time to help prevent other people's grief at that time. But I have had to do very little. There was somebody in our congregation who passed away this past week, and she needed the funeral home wanted someone to help dress her.
Mhm.
And so I know that that's what she had wanted, was
Wow.
to
Yeah.
have someone from church do that. Sorry.
So it's good. I agree. It's good to have those conversations with people ahead of time, but it can still be really difficult to have those conversations. And where do we start? I usually, in those conversations, I don't use the word death. um, I usually will use the terms end of life, and will ask the individual, do you want to talk about end of life plans, or I would like to talk about end of life plans. I want to know what you would like. And, then you can start with, would you like to be buried? Would you like to be cremated? Do you have any last, wishes or things that are important to you to have? Um, do you want a service? It's been interesting. Some people that I've run into, um, they didn't want the service after they were gone. They decided to do going away celebrations, and would invite all their friends and family to do one last big celebration. So um, those 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 are kind of neat. And then just to see the variety of what people choose. And I find that if you make plans there, it seems like that time is more impactful than if there are no plans and the family is left having to try to arrange everything. And in that, grief state, the family feels like, you just struggle to think and to make decisions. So I encourage people to go through that ahead of
Yeah.
time.
I
Um,
actually, I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted to, can I quickly chime in? Yeah, I love Shark Tank. Maybe it's not always so good, but I love Shark Tank where the people come with their business ideas, because people have such awesome ideas. And I actually saw something the other day where somebody created this website, everything, where you can go in and you can write down everything you want for your funeral. And you've
Oh,
got your insurance, you've got like funeral insurance, you can pay for it, and then exactly what song you want to play on your funeral, what you want to do. And I thought that's
yeah,
actually very cool, actually, because you know, you never know when that day is going to come. I mean, you could be
right,
70 and then it happens, you
right.
could be 28. So there's not a specific time where you can start thinking about it. But I think people are so scared of death that it's a very weird thing to think about. But if you consider it enough, I mean, you can't leave other people with all those decisions. I mean, I don't even know. I've buried two granddads, three actually. Um, and the other day, my mom actually almost she had a near-death experience. Her lips turned blue. She was choking on food and it just wasn't coming out. And it was just such a shock for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was a shock. It was the first time that I was scared of my mom actually going. And I was just like, I'm not ready
Right.
for this. I'm not ready for that. I'm really not.
I'm glad you bring up that fear. We really need to address it. And I think, that's really what's behind some of that lack of discussion in this area, is that, it's kind of taboo. People feel like if they even mention the word, that, it's going to be sooner than later. And we need to break
Yeah,
through that fear and, realize that ultimately we have no control over our days. We can't prolong them, we can't lessen them. At the end of the day, the Lord alone is sovereign over that day of our death and when He calls us home. And if we're finding that we're really struggling with different fears around death, we really need to address and deal with those. Um, and it can
absolutely.
be hard when you've had traumatic experiences. I think, that adds to that fear of death. And it seems like when that fear comes, it's just an intense panic that you can't get a hold of.
Yeah, and let alone organize a funeral with the right things that you think your mom would like, So it's with all that, that suddenly happens to you. It's very hard, I mean, to start, do you want to be cremated and all that kind of stuff, to think even those thoughts. So
Yeah.
best to do it beforehand. But yeah, the fear of death, I'm not scared of death. I'm not scared because I know I'm going back to God. It's like, it's fine. But when I think about, like, take my mom example, it's like, she's not going to be here with me. And that fear of losing somebody to care for, I don't even want to talk about it. I don't want to go through your things. What do you want, Mom? What do you want on your funeral? You can't have that discussion because it does trigger that. And people do think that if you speak it, then it happens. A lot of people think that. But I think we need to really, for me personally, our attitude towards death needs a little lighter side, in the sense of we're going back to heaven. It's just, we're going to miss you for a while, but I'll see you back later. And it's, I do believe
I
that.
agree. And I kind of got a little bit of that, with one of my sons. He had to go in for emergency surgery. And it was really funny, because as he's like being wheeled down the hallway, he's like, Mom, if I die, Viking funeral. He's like, you better put me out on a river and start me on fire. And I was like, we're not even going to talk about that. And he's like, no. He's like, Viking funeral. And then we got into the elevator and he says it again, like in front of the hospital staff. And I was like, will you stop? And then I, finally was like, why not make it lighthearted, And so I said, well, you know me, I'm going to load up that little pallet with lots of popcorn. So as you go out and the fire starts, we're all going to see popcorn flying in the air, and that imagery then made it a much lighter discussion, and made it easier to deal with. But, so it's good to, I guess it's okay for us to give permission to not have to make the topic of death a serious topic. We can, without guilt, we can laugh, we can make jokes. The timing of those things, though, is important because you may get others that would be offended or hurt, by your lightheartedness. But in general, I think it's okay just to give permission to make it a lighthearted topic.
Okay.
But good discussion. All right, let's go on to the next chapter here. It's chapter 18, Out of the Mouths of Babes. For most of my children's lives, we were in the habit of reading scripture every night. My first 3 children had all given their hearts to the Lord around age 5. My 4th child was around that age at that time, and I would take extra time talking about Jesus and his love. However, every time I began to speak of Jesus coming back and returning, Jonah would stick his fingers in his ears and he would begin to scream, I don't want to hear that. I could not figure out why he had such a fearful and dramatic reaction to hearing about Christ's return. I didn't know what to do, but kept praying for the Lord to open the doors of salvation to him. Every Sunday we would go to church, and our church had a library and had Christian family-oriented movies that could be borrowed. We had gotten in the habit of checking out 2 every week to watch. That Sunday, as we sat watching the movie, suddenly the most horrific scene of hell I have ever seen came onto the screen. The kids started screaming and crying and yelling for me to turn it off. I scrambled, but I couldn't find the remote. Josiah was sitting cross-legged right next to Jonah on the floor. As I desperately searched for the remote, suddenly Josiah turns to Jonah and, emphasizing each word, he said, Jonah, that's where you're going. Jonah's eyes became very wide. A look of sheer terror came over his face, and then he began to cry and scream. I don't want to go there. no, I don't want to go there. I want to know Jesus. Josiah said, let's pray, Jonah. Some truths can only come from the mouths of babes. So all that to share that Josiah was actually the one that led his brother to the Lord. It was not, the type of typical situation I would think for coming to the Lord, but um, I look back now and I laugh because, I will never just forget the sheer horror. It's like I've seen some pretty horrific horror scenes, in different movies, and I was like, what the heck did the pastor couldn't have watched this movie because he would not have put it in there knowing that, the little kids are watching stuff. Um, but it was just like such an intense scene, and I just remember the kids yelling and screaming, and they're like, turn it off, turn it off. And I'm like, I can't, where's the remote? Who took it? And I'm scrambling all over. And then it was like all of a sudden just this slowed down moment in time. And I turned my head to look at Jonah and Josiah as I hear Josiah saying, Jonah, that's where you're going. And I just will never forget that.
Right.
But as we talk about the fear of death, that's really many people struggle with that. And how do we give assurance, especially as somebody's passing, if we're there with them, how do we give that assurance? And for me, I found, working with different individuals, one of the ways you could do that is by singing hymns. A lot of the old hymns have that salvation message in them, and there's just like an assurance, especially if the individual you're dealing with has grown up, in the church, or especially the older, the Catholic, the Baptist, kind of the mainstream religions, the Lutheran. They know those hymns and they find, comfort in that. So singing can be one of the ways that we can minister and bring that comfort to somebody who's dying. The other challenge in death is that, especially if it's a sudden one, or if the family doesn't get to speak to the individual before they pass, there can be that challenge of them really struggling, not knowing where their family member went. And, you don't want to be put in a situation where you're lying to the family, saying, oh, don't worry, it's okay, they're in heaven. I've seen some pastors and people who have done that and then been on the other end where the family is having, family members are having horrific nightmares about their loved one calling out to them, crying out that they're in hell. And, and so that can be really difficult. So what I usually do is I will pray with them and I'll ask the Lord to just give them a peace, to not worry, to not fear or be afraid, but just to have that peace, to know that the Lord knows. And I've had some individuals after that where they've received, a dream or a vision where they've then seen their family member in heaven. But even just admitting the reality of that situation can sometimes be the most comfort you can give, in saying, that this is a matter really that's just between that individual and God. And we're not privy to that outcome yet. We don't know. So in that, we hope and we trust that, when we get to our final destination, that we will be reunited with that person. And, using some of that language. But have any of you ever had some of that, or that you look like you're shaking your head?
Oh,
Yep.
I always, I feel like it's important to reiterate that we're not the judge. We're not the ultimate judge, and that we have one who is perfect and all knowing. And so I guess that prayer for peace is regarding is really looking forward with faith in that process. My thoughts are, or my questions are, how do you pitch that with people who may not be believing?
Mm-hmm.
Can
Yeah.
I add something?
Go ahead.
I just add something to that. I think it's based on circumstances, but I grew up on a farm, so death was all around with the animals and so on. So it's became something you got used to, your favorite dog or your duck or whatever goes. And then I had the circumstances where both, I held my father's hand for 5 days. But I held and when he passed, then I used to phone my mother every night for 15 years. And so I watched her deteriorate. So when she went, and she had planned everything. She had planned the whole funeral and everything. I don't want you guys to have any problems, so I've paid for this and done that and organized. And that was her. But then, so you got used to it. And in their passing, we actually celebrated their lives when we partied afterwards. You get what I mean? But writing the eulogy was obviously the hardest part for me, because that was bringing back all the memories at the time. So,
Right.
But then I had a job, or I had one of my many jobs and or businesses was in a garage. So we used to attend accidents on the freeway. And one example was, for example, we turned up at one, and the two kids were sitting in the street crying, and the car had turned right over, driven by the grandfather of the kids, and mother he'd gone. He was also with the kids, but mother had been killed in the passenger seat. So you're now watching crying kids, father who doesn't know what's happened, a mother that's gone. And there was a very good friend of mine who was the policeman, right? So we cleaned up and so on, and finally moved her body out of the passenger seat. But that came, going back to what Morne said, was, how do you handle it on others? Do you get what I mean? And you see, my father, as I said, I held his hand for 5 days. I phoned my mother. Even her last words to me, because I phoned the hospital and my sister showed the phone, and she said she was nearly comatose, and she would picked up enough just to say, "My darling," and that was it. That was, and looked at me, and I knew, right? So there was no need for the tears or whatever, because it had got there. But then in my wife's case, she'd phoned her father, and father had phoned her just before Christmas. And he obviously knew he was going to pass. And he said, "I want to talk to you about this and that and everything." And she said, "Dad, don't worry. I'm coming there for Christmas in Germany, and I'll see you then." Well, it didn't happen, because 2 days later he went to, and his heart went, right? So I'm just talking about circumstances where one is, for me, the passing of my dear ones was, we knew, we went through the process, right? Whereas the passing of other people's, and that situation of dead bodies in cars and things like that, I actually said to this policeman, I said, you've done this for years, right? He said, "Do you ever get used to it?" And he said, "Hey, John, no." Right. So just the circumstances around it. I just thought I'd give a couple of anecdotes.
Yeah, no, those were great. Yeah, both of them can be very challenging, and it really is, very individualistic, because everybody deals with grief differently. Um, and we almost have to be adaptable in that moment. And what I find is, you know, going into a situation and asking, what does that person need? Um, obviously, when you have children that have just been shocked, they're seeing their mother dead, they're realizing she's gone. What's needed? They need that comfort. They need somebody just to hold them, to let them cry, and, to go through that process. And, most of the time, children can tell you what they need, as can, adults, where, when you say, what do you want to do right now? You know, I guess I word it that way because usually when you say, what do you need right now?
Yeah.
The response you're going to get is, I don't know. But if you say, what do you want to do right now? Usually they can tell you, I just want to sit here, or
I
I
like
just
that.
want to cry. I just need to be held. And maybe even suggesting, in very simple sentences, because, with that grief hitting the mind, people aren't really able to think through complex sentences. So, that's why I'll make it short, brief statements. Do you want to eat? Do you need a drink? Um, in fact, most of the time, giving a glass of water can be the best, especially when they're going into shock. We had a young couple in the NICU, and their baby had been on the ECMO machine. And then, the doctor had called me in and said, hey, we're about to tell the family that this has not worked out. And, we're going to basically pull the plug on the baby. And he had told me, he said, why don't you go get just have a glass of water on you for them? And it was like, okay, so I went and got a glass of water. But then I found out quickly why, because as soon as he told, the husband and wife, all of a sudden I just remember watching the wife's face. She, as the shock came over her, she just all of a sudden turned very pale white. And he actually stood behind her. And then I just like put the cup of water in her hand and I said, come on, let's sit down. And we sat her down. So, for those harder things, you got to remember that you're dealing with shock, especially if people have witnessed a sudden death. You're going to have that shock reaction going on as well. So, again, the best things is, I found it, put something in their hand, because it then kind of gives them that tangible grounding. So whether it's a pillow, usually it'd be a Kleenex, or probably the biggest ones I use are a Kleenex or a glass of water, and just sit them down. And then the touch is very important, rubbing their back or putting an arm on their shoulder. That really grounds people in the shock. And you can do the same thing if somebody's in a severe accident and you come on the scene. You just want to sit with them, be present with them, pray with them, hear what they have to say. Give them that space to talk. I usually won't answer any direct questions. you know um I've had some really bad situations where the person starts to say, am I dying? And they are. um but I simply, instead of saying yes or making it harder for them, I'll make it more lighthearted and say, well, keep fighting. This definitely is a difficult situation. And I'll say, are there, things you want to share, or, things you'd like me to say to your family if they can't, if we don't know if the family is going to get there in time. And will let them get some of that off their chest. But it can be really difficult dealing with those situations, which then brings us to the aftercare for, especially people who have been involved in the situation like that, like whether it's EMT, firemen, police officers, other family members. All of those people need to be supported because, you know, I found that a time of processing after the event is always good. So, whether it's the nursing home, the hospitals, or, working with emergency services, we usually would, make a time and a date where, all of those people who'd been involved in that incident could come together and debrief and just, express their feelings, express what they experienced in the situation. And, like we used to write up in the debriefings, we would, use a whiteboard and, we would start with what was the most difficult thing for everybody in that. And then we would kind of make those our discussion points. And then we would end with, what did you take away from that? And that's where we would look at kind of the lighter side of it or the things that we learned. And that seemed to be a pretty, easy way to debrief some of that. And that's important, especially if children are involved, to include them in that process, to let them know that it's not a bad thing to discuss, somebody's death or to work through the grief of it. So,
Yeah, exactly. I definitely, if we had a more healthy way of dealing with grief, because I don't think we have mastered that yet. Or well, maybe we have, but I can't remember that those days. But keeping everything secret, and it's like if the parents can't grieve, kids are good with grieving. I mean, if a kid loses its dog and stuff, you explain it to them properly, they cry, they get over it quicker. But we as adults, we tend to suppress, tend to avoid, tend to deflect, and then suddenly
right.
one day when you had too many shots of tequila, then suddenly everything comes down and then everything goes crazy. So we definitely need a more healthy way of dealing with grief. And I like the sense of humor because, it was fun times. We had fun times. I must say, with my 3 grandfathers, our family can see the light side and everything, and we talk about those stories and that, and not the stuff that they were lacking, but the good things they brought in our lives, and that really brings out that lighter side. But what I wanted to say is that, like you said, grief for every person individually, it's different. So when you have to deal with somebody else's grief, it's always an open book. And it's like, and Jessie, you're amazing. I mean, you've been working with this as a chaplain and everything. I can just imagine the stories that you could probably write a whole book of the people that you helped out of the, your chaplain. But yeah, definitely, each human, I mean, the thing is, we are human on this planet. As a soul, it's easier to understand. We'll be going back to God. But as a human, we need to go through the process of grief, loss. I mean, even if you know that thing is not lost forever, but it's still loss, and we feel it. And for each person, that is different. So it's like, just when that happens and you're in that position, just be an open book and allow God to work through you. That's the only thing that I think one can do. That's what I've been doing when I've had people in my life come to me when they've lost people. It's just like, allow them the space to speak and guide them. And I love that what you're saying when you were saying you don't even think the person is going to make it, but what is it that you want me to tell to your family? That is so beautiful, because those are usually the things that make fear of death even more scarier. Is because we fear the things that we haven't said to each other. We fear the things we haven't done. We fear the things we haven't hugged them enough or haven't forgiven them. So that's the fear of death that really when you're busy dying, it's like those things start coming up, those guilts, the resentments. And it's a
Yeah.
very big thing to ask them, what do you want to get off your chest? Because that is salvation, because in that moment,
Mhm.
you're giving that spirit that opportunity to go back to the Father, back to
Yeah.
God.
And it works the other way too. I've had where patients are sedated or unconscious, and I have the family members that, they're struggling, there's things they want to say, and I'll remind them, I'll say, their spirit is very conscious. So, it's proven scientifically that people, the last thing to go is the hearing. So it's like, say what you need to say, get close, even though they're not reacting to you. Um, say what you need to say, and I'll encourage them even to hold a hand. And it's funny that, the individual may not be able to wake up or actively respond, but I would say probably 70% of the time I witness that when I encourage people to start talking to their loved one, to reassure them, to hold their hand, that they would get either a hand squeeze or they would start seeing the eyes, blinking, but not fully opening. So there was some sort of nonverbal response that, the dying person was able to give. So, there's been several times where, people have been unconscious for days, and all of a sudden, their loved one starts talking to them, and their eyes open up, and they look at them, and so it's
Yeah,
interesting how that can happen.
yeah, both ways.
So good stuff. Well, let's go to the last chapter for today here.
Not,
Um,
not.
this one is called oh, maybe I fast forward just a little bit. Hold on here. Not hell. And so some of our discussion here kind of goes into this next chapter. Maybe you have a loved one and you are concerned that they do not know the Lord. I share the following story for your comfort. One night, I got a call from the hospital to meet a family's request. What was the nature of the request? As the nurse put it, the family wants you to get here and get the patient saved. As I headed to the patient's room, I was expecting to see a family and to be pulled into an argument of religious beliefs. I was surprised when I stood in the doorway of the patient's room, and not only was there no family, but the patient was sedated and unable to communicate. How do you have a conversation about the afterlife with the unconscious? I pulled up a chair and I spent the next 2 hours singing to him. Upon the 2 hour mark, suddenly I had a very powerful vision. I saw the Lord reach down from heaven and run his hand gently along the man's face. It was a tender moment I shall never forget, which brought me to tears. When I left the room, I approached the nurse and I gave her a message for the family. I said, please tell the family God is with him. And when you are unsure of your loved one's fate, let your heart rest knowing that God is near. So I shared that actually in our last show on solutions about miracles. I share that story in further detail and talked about, how that was, I was trying to figure out, what do I say to the family? How do I reassure them? And that was, the only thing I could say at the end was, just that God is with him. And what then happened was a miracle. The next morning I got called back and the gentleman had not passed away. And in fact, he was trying to communicate. And the nursing staff, asked me to come back. And I finally figured he was trying to ask for a pen and paper. And so we got him a pen and paper. And then I sat there, deciphering each word he was trying to write out. And in the end, he wrote out a sentence and he said, tell the doctors I want to live. And he had had a do not resuscitate order on his chart, and so they ended up having to change that. But what was interesting was the Lord, he didn't pass away, so he ended up going home after that. And I believe that that night, as I sat with him, that the Lord had worked a miracle in his life and had brought healing to him. So very interesting. So some of those, that can be a challenging, place to be, especially with family dynamics. And you do find you get those families that, it's almost like they want to push, they want to know that their loved one is going to heaven, and they will push that concept of salvation. And, I found that it's not helpful to somebody who's dying to have family or people there who are pushing that salvation. Certainly we want to see everybody go into heaven. So how do you deal with that type of situation? I would usually say, well, I'm the chaplain, and, I would like to, I hear your concerns. I hear that this is important to you, but I'm going to ask you to step out for a minute so I can have a private conversation with the patient. And so I'll have them step out of the room. And then that's when I will, just open that door of conversation with the patient. And I have had individuals that outright, say, don't talk to me about Jesus. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear anything about the Bible. And what can you do but simply respect them? They make their choice. And as hard as it is, those honestly are some of the toughest deaths that I've had to experience. In fact, one guy was so angry with God, it was really horrible. His poor wife and daughter were absolutely in tears because he got so vicious and was yelling and screaming at God in his anger, to the point where he was saying, "Take me now," and had lots of cussing. And he was literally scratching his body up as he yelled at God. And all you can do, finally the staff, we all, talked with each other, and the nurses and doctors, and we're like, we really just have to respect where he's at. There's nothing we can do to change his mind. There's nothing we can do to make his anger at God go away. That's something he has to wrestle and work out with God. And, maybe what we need to do, instead of, hovering, catering, trying to console him, we just need to leave the room and let him have his moment with God. And so that's what we did. And, as difficult as it was, we just all walked out and let him go the way that he needed to go. I've had people that have come back after they've passed, and have made comments like, don't talk to me about God. Even after they've left their body, they come back because they really don't want to hear about God. So it can get very difficult at times to maneuver some of those things. I praise the Lord for those that, have a peaceful, quiet death where they just, quietly go with the Lord, and there isn't that struggle or the wrestling. But I encourage for people who have experienced that, find somebody that you can, share the story with, and talk about, how difficult that was to go through and navigate, and process, allow yourself time to process the things you experienced in that. But
What does pushing
go ahead.
for salvation, what does that look like? that you have seen? What do you see families or friends doing at end of life that is pushing for salvation?
I especially like I've seen where they, will make it adamant that they have to give that salvation message, and the patient will be saying, no, I don't want to hear that right now, or I don't want that. That's not my beliefs. And they still continue to
Oh,
target the patient for the right to be heard and to give that gospel message, because most of them, the family will feel it's their duty that they have to give
okay.
that message before the person dies, but the person will be rejecting and not wanting to hear it, from them. So, I've had people who literally will come in and put the Bible on their lap and start, just pushing it. And the patient's like, struggling for air, they're struggling to breathe, they're on oxygen, and they're like, I don't, I'm just trying to breathe right now. I don't even want to think about this or, hear this. And you get where it's just that disrespectful,
Yes.
not, there's a difference between those who come in and say, can I share with you something? And the patient is in agreement with that, versus those that are doing it of their own, for their own agenda at that point. Um, so I hope that answers your question, because there's a
Yes.
difference. Like, I found if I gently come in, the Lord will open that doorway for conversation where I can share, the gospel message with them. And usually that comes just in natural conversation. And, or I'll be asking, how are you doing right now with things? Do you have any fears? Um, is there anything you need to be assured of? You know, um, where do you stand with this? Do you know where you're going? Are there any fears around that? And those questions will open up that door of discussion. But, I think it's where I've seen it more is, kind of those very last moments where there's been, kind of a distance between the
Yes.
individual dying and the family members, where there's been, um, usually it includes rebellion or somebody who's walked away from the family, somebody who's gotten into drugs or alcohol. Um, and you'll see, those family members desperate to get their loved one saved.
So
So
really it turns into this matter of control, and it really violates the person's free will. And
right,
it's an assault in some respects.
yeah,
And you asking find out questions, you are really allowing them their will, their free will. That's an extraordinary technique. I mean,
Yeah.
mm,
I also thought that it's like, instead of giving them Jesus quotes, it's being Jesus
yeah,
for
yeah.
them. Being Jesus for them. So instead of giving them the quotes, just be Jesus in the sense of be that kindness, be that compassion, be that wisdom, ask them the questions. And Jessie, you're doing brilliant with that. It's to connect those people back to God. You don't necessarily,
yeah,
if they don't want to quote, you can just give them love, and love connects them. And then miracles do happen. I'm sure a
right.
lot of people then at the end of that conversation do find some peace with God. Because
Yeah, the other thing is the singing. Like I would do a lot of singing with the hymns, and I would just, ask,
that's
would it be
powerful.
okay if I sing to you for a little bit? Is it okay if I sing some hymns? And they would say yes. And then within those hymns, there's so much of the gospel and so much about relationship with God that, basically that singing became a form of evangelism. And then,
Yeah.
at the time I would pause, or, if they had questions, or, if they were unsure about something, that's usually when it would come up, where I would sing Amazing Grace. And then after I was done, they would say, I really question, or I struggle to know, am I going to get into heaven? And then it opens that door for you to
Yes.
address their
Yes.
question and,
Mhm.
share with them the truth. So,
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah,
Power of the voice. Beautiful.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. And a few I've literally sang straight into heaven, that, it was with two of them specifically, I was singing Psalm 23, and they passed as I was singing that song. So
Wow.
very interesting.
Amazing.
so I will thank you. It seems like if I were reflect that back, it's that you gave an offering and it really was from your heart, and you invited you invited an environment, and then that allowed them. Oh, I had better thoughts just a minute ago.
Yeah, it allowed them to enter that space of relationship with God. And
Yeah.
it's funny, especially,
Oh.
I think our generation, we still have, a lot of people from the 40s on to, well, now it's like the 50s and 60s, but many of those individuals, were raised in the church. They're very familiar with the hymns. When you start singing to people who come out of that generation, they'll automatically start singing too. And it's
Oh,
funny that
yeah.
singing is different. I'm trying to think how to describe it, but you use a different lung capacity than you do just breathing.
Yes.
So I have had where people who are struggling to breathe, all of a sudden they'll join in singing and they're able to sing. It's one of the
That's so
last things
nice.
to go. Like, they're able to join in that song. Um, so very interesting how some of that
Wow.
works with the body,
Yeah.
that they're able to praise if they want to praise.
Wow.
Um, yeah.
I guess what
Beautiful.
came back, it fell out of my brain, and then I think it came back. What I meant is you were allowing free will. I think when we can sabotage situations, when you want to give people Jesus scriptures, or someone else wants to tell you how to feel or how to handle it, that changes the dynamic to control, and it doesn't allow people's own expressions, regardless of whether it's people who are grieving or the person who is actually passing. But by you asking find out questions and by singing,
Mhm.
that seems to be a magic, and I don't mean magic in that way, but it seems to open up a beautiful environment.
Right. And that's really what it's about, creating that environment that, is comforting, that brings peace, that brings that stillness as that person is making that final stretch in life. Um, there are individuals or companies that specialize, they want to push um, kind of what would we call it, a stamp, or it's like, this is the way death should go. And they go down to the, T of having to, you want to put the lights down, you're going to have candles, you're going to do
Oh.
this or that or that. And, I really had to fight in that clinical world to say, death is not something that's, a pat answer for everybody. Everybody is not the same. Something that may be comforting to one person or their family definitely may not be comforting or reassuring for another. And the only way that we will know what that individual or their family needs is we need to communicate, we need to ask, we need to be observant. Um, and we really have to go off of the leading of the Lord in every situation because every situation is going to be different. And, so we can't fall. I'm somebody who advocates against, going in there and saying, oh, this is what you need. It's,
Oh,
death
yeah.
is not our agenda. Um, it's a sacred moment that God allows us to be a part of that really we're a steward of. A steward of ushering that individual into the arms of the Lord. And, we can't, if we make it all about method and practice, we're losing what that moment really is meant to be. And, even scripture says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of the saints. So much so, even in, Genesis, it says that when Moses died, that, the angel of the Lord fought for the body, because the enemy was fighting for his body as well. So, we have to remember that moment is precious to the Lord. Why? Because that's the moment, that transformation happens. Um, you know, and we have to remember that transformation is both spiritual and physical. Like, even though we don't see the full physical transformation yet until the Lord returns, we know that there's going to be that full transformation into that physical spiritual body in the twinkling of an eye. And so that's why it is precious to the Lord and important to him, because he's doing a work. He's forming that eternal state for that individual.
Yeah, just as you are being formed in your mother's womb, that unique special blueprint when you're getting born, your fingerprint of life, so too is your exit. So too is your exit. Perfectly planned. I personally believe it's all divinely planned. So each one has a unique, special way of transforming back to God and transforming into earth through your mother.
Right.
So I think it's basically the same process, and it's sacred and it's beautiful. It's amazing. I think we haven't even touched the surface of what happens and what happens then when that happens. Right. Yeah. Well, awesome. Well,
sorry, before we close, may I just share something in remembering Mother?
Absolutely.
Mother passed end of August, and my sister's busy going through all of her things and so on. So she sent yesterday Mother, which was written in May 1981, 40 years ago.
Wow.
And it's Mother's letter to God.
Wow. Oh, if you'd like to read or hear that, we would love to hear that.
Well, the first little part of it is the thank you, right? So it's, my dear Father God, thank you for the blessings you have given us, for the love and health you also give us, and the new understanding we have of you. Thank you further for all you have given me, my family, friends, and my home. For this journey we are about to take, Father, thank you most humbly for it and for the love we will receive. Father, I ask that you protect this home and call in it while we are away. Safeguard it from all harm. May peace be returned within its walls and harmony within the family overshadow all. I can't read that, but right. As I thank you for my children and all the new ones, please, Father, bless them, give healing to them, and may they grow in love and health. Most of all, Tracy, David, Mark, Joanne, Peter, and also Paddy and John. So that was letter. It was a real surprise. So that was a letter to God, which you won't get nowadays because it'll be an email and it'll get lost.
Right? Maybe we need to restart something new,
Yeah.
where we encourage people to write a letter to God, their last prayer for their family.
There was another one that she sent, which was for one of my brothers. Yeah.
That should be included with this funeral plan. My favorite song.
Yes.
My letter to God.
Yes. Yes.
Letter to God.
All
Very
right.
good. Well, how precious, John. Thank you for sharing
you.
that.
It's
So very powerful.
Thank you.
So, well, I'm going to close us in a prayer and then we'll close up. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can take this matter lightheartedly. I thank you for just the joy and the rejoicing in some of the topic today, that we don't have to fear, that we don't need to be afraid, that we don't have to be unequipped to deal with these matters or help others to go through them. I thank you that you walk us through these things, that you teach us how to, just as you teach us how to live, you also teach us how to enter into that place of death. And I thank you that you're guiding each one. I thank you that you're giving us the tools that we need to walk others through these things as well. And we just thank you for the precious lives of those who have gone before us. We thank you that many are up where you are cheering us on, that they are cheering forward our faith, our courage, our strength, and the trials that we go through, that they rejoice in our overcoming. And we thank you above all things that even death we shall overcome. We praise your name and we pray in your precious name, Jesus.
Amen.
All right, amen. Well, blessings to all of you this week.
Amen.
So,
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your talents and all that you offer. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for your sharing. I appreciated that today. So, all right,
Thank you,
blessings.
everybody. Thank you, Jessie. And for everybody that's listening to the recording afterwards, thank you for listening. Give us a like, give us a share this information. And yes, share, and love. And for everybody that's going through grief, just know that you're not alone and we all go through this together. Thank you,
Yeah, and feel free to
everybody.
share or join us for the next one, for this process.
I see we got 3 more chapters left, so we're gonna do one more, part 7. 7 is a good number. I think 7 parts is a good one. So I'll let
and then we'll
everybody
have
know
to discuss next week the next book we're gonna get into.
Yes, definitely. We'll definitely have to find something else to read. Maybe the initiates of the flames. No. Let's think about something.
No.
Over that. Let's focus on the healing right now. Yeah. So anyways, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jessie. Sending you much love to everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
All the best. Ciao.